Series going through the book of Esther. We wrapped up the book of Acts 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, and we've been looking at this book of Esther. The book of Esther is the only book, as we've said here, is the only book in the whole of the Bible that does not mention the name of God once. It's kind of hard to believe that a book in the Bible doesn't mention God and is there, and that God has a reason for it, but there is an incredible reason for this book being in the Bible and why the Holy Spirit has preserved it. And we see that the king of Persia has 127 provinces in his kingdom, huge kingdom, the greatest of the day. The Jews have been taken captive and brought into Persia, and the king decides to throw a party. And it's not just a regular party, it's a party that lasts 6 months. A 6-month party without any restrictions. You can do whatever and have whatever you want. That's what he throws. And as soon as he's done with that party, he throws another party for a whole other week. And he does this, he has these parties here because he wants to show off how great his kingdom is. And at the end of this 6-month and 1-week party, he's shown off everything of his kingdom, the splendor of the kingdom. Everybody can have whatever they want. There's only one thing he hasn't shown off yet, and that is his queen. And he calls the queen to come, and she declines. And so he's like, what are we going to do? So he gets his boys together, and we figure out, what are we going to do about this situation? And they tell him, unless she's going to cause everybody else to disobey you, king, and maybe even in the households, you can't have this happen. You've got to let her go. Get rid of her. And that's what he does. And after a while, he gets depressed. And those around him say, well, let's find you a new queen. Let's find you somebody. And so they call for all of the land, for all of the single, most beautiful women of the land to come forward. And they go and they take them, and they have 1 year to get ready to be before the king so he could choose his next queen. And with a book with the title of Esther, you could probably guess who that next queen ended up being, right? It was Esther. And so that happens. Esther was an orphaned girl, was being raised by her cousin, but the Bible tells us that she was beautiful inside and out, and this is the reason that the king picked her. And then the story turns to a twist, as we've seen so far. Haman shows up. Haman becomes basically second in command in all of the kingdom, and because of that, he wants everybody to bow down before him. Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin, who took care of her, who raised her, he wouldn't bow before Haman. And so the people asked him, why won't you bow before Mordecai? Or before Haman? And Mordecai says, I don't, because I am a Jew. And that meant I don't bow before anything or anyone on earth, because I only worship God Almighty. And so because of that, Haman got very upset and decided that not only was he going to get rid of Mordecai, he wanted to get rid of every one of his people. And so the decree went out. He bribed the king to send this decree out to kill every single Jew in all the provinces of Persia. That's where we are so far. It's how far we've gotten is. And so the thing is, in our own lives, it's easy for us to think that we can't make much of a difference. Sometimes we feel that way. We feel like, well, there's so many other people out there in this world today that are better, that are stronger, that are smarter, or even better looking than me. How am I going to make a difference? What do I have to offer? And that might have even been Esther's first thought here in all of this. Who am I to make a difference? The thing is, there is only one of you. You're the only one with your heritage, your experiences, your hardships that you've faced in your life, the successes that you've had in your life. You are the only one with those certain things. And God has you here in this moment for a reason. And history has shown us that there's so much has been done to better our world through just one person. We've seen it. I saw a couple of things this week that I wanted to show to you, or to just let you know and tell you, that puts this all into perspective, the power of one. In 1776, with one vote pushed this over. English became the national language of America instead of German. It was one vote. One person decided, yeah, let's go for English, and now that's our language and not German. It's surprising to me. It's just crazy to think that it came down to one vote. You can look at it kind of from the other side then, because in 1973 it was one vote that pushed Adolf Hitler to be in control of the Nazi Party. One vote, one person that pushed it over. And when we look at the Bible, we see more often than not it's one man or it's one woman who made a difference. It's one person who set the direction that the nation would go, or who was stood in the gap for their people and changed their times. Usually it was one person. And throughout the Bible, we see God using this one person who thought and said and did what was right, regardless of what might happen. And as a result, they did great, incredible things. And we see this throughout the Bible. Let me just show you a couple of scriptures. In Ezekiel chapter 22, it says, "And I sought for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand in the breach before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found no one." But I found none, it says. God was looking for that one person. 2 Chronicles 16:9, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him." One more verse. It's Isaiah 59, verse 15. It says, "Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. The Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. He saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him." See, what God is looking for, he's looking for that one person who will do what he asks. And we're going to see here in this book of Esther that it's one woman who decides that it's worth the risk to break with the norm, to speak her mind, to stand up. And because of it, a nation is saved. And obviously, if we're in the book of Esther, we know that that woman is Esther, right? And so, again, we left off last week seeing that the Jews had been threatened with extinction. This man Haman, he held on to a grudge that had been passed on down his family line from generation to generation to generation of their hatred of the Jews. And so now that he is in this place of power, basically second command in the kingdom, he is going to use that power to take care of this grudge that he's held on to his whole life, that he's been taught. It wasn't something he was born with. It's something that he was taught. He learned from those around him. He had influence with the king, and he gave lots of money to the king to see this happen. And so it was going to be 1 year from that moment that all of the Jews in the kingdom were going to be put to death. And this decree went out to every single person in the kingdom. And this leads us to ask, how did the people take this news in the kingdom? Like, what were they thinking? How did they respond to this decree? If you actually go back to Exodus 3, verse 15, we saw it at the end of last week, but I want to look at it again. It's verse 15 of chapter 3. It tells us there, "And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion." So the king and Haman, they're like, "Oh, this is a great idea. Let's wipe out all the Jews." And they just sat down to drink. But the rest of the city and the rest of the kingdom was in confusion, like, what is going on here? Why would anybody do something like this? And I can imagine that the city was in confusion, but can you imagine all of the Jews, what they were feeling? They were beyond confused in this moment. They were probably, like, terror seized them in this moment. And they're thinking, why is this happening? Why would they want to do this? And this fear would lead them to think, how are we going to stop this? Can we stop this? How do we fight this thing? Because this was the law. A decree back then, an edict that was sent out through the kingdom during this time, that was final. That was the final word on the thing. It couldn't be changed. I can imagine a lot of them lost all hope in that moment. And even though God isn't mentioned one time in this book, I'm going to tell you something. God has not abandoned his people. He has not left them in this moment. In his sovereign plan, he had one person who could make a difference. One person who could stand in the gap for their people, and her name was Esther. So if you're in Esther chapter 4, let's read some of this, and we'll get into this, and then we're going to see in a little bit what this means for us today. So Esther chapter 4, we're going to read verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city, in the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. So in this time, when somebody went through something that was painful, that they went through some sort of terrible disaster, they would put on this dark clothing that was very loose-fitting. It was made of goat's hair, and then they would take the ashes from a put-out fire that had cooled down, and they would throw them on top of themselves, and they would just be covered by these ashes. And then sometimes, even then, in the middle of a cold ash heap, they would sit in it and just keep throwing the ashes on top of them. And they did this as a visible sign of their pain and their grief that they were going through. Now, people mourn in all sorts of different ways. For the most part, in America, out here, our grief is usually restrained. We don't make a big scene of our pain and our hurts. It's done quietly. It's often hidden. We don't like to show our pain. In the Middle East, pain and sorrow have always been shown openly and visibly and very vocally. They wail and they mourn. And this is what Mordecai is doing here in this moment. He is in pain. He's seeing what's about to happen, and he goes and he shows it visibly. He doesn't hold anything back. He's in those sackcloth. He put the ashes on him, and he takes his grief to the city, the gate of the palace there. Look at verse 2. It says, he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. So Mordecai knew he couldn't go past that gate dressed as he was in his mourning. The gate was the place where the king would normally come out to meet with the people and to make judgments on things, judge certain situations that need to be dealt with. And so he may not be able to, that his hope here was that the king would be out there and that he would be able to show the king his visible pain over this edict, how it was affecting the people. He may even wanted to have Queen Esther find out what was going on, to see him this way. Because now that she is queen, she is secluded into this highly protected area, and she probably has no idea that this edict even went out. She's so far away from the concerns of the common people now as the queen. But we also see that Mordecai is not the only one who is mourning this way. It's all throughout the Persia. It's not just at the king's gate. Look at verse 3 now. Esther 4 verse 3 says, and in every province where the king's command and his decree reached, there was a great mourning among the Jews with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. People were mourning all over the kingdom. And it's interesting to me that the mourning, when people are in mourning, it just seems to bring people together. Have you ever noticed that? Like one of the last times our country was one of the, probably the most unified that it ever was after the 9/11 attacks. We just saw our nation come together, and in that morning, and people went to those areas, and they helped and took care of people, and all the mess, and nobody was forced to respond to this, but people just went. Suffering pushes us out of our homes. It brings people together. It brings us together even with our neighbors when we all go through hurts and suffering. And the amazing thing that I've noticed is that suffering has never harmed, never ruined a nation. Maybe it's harmed, but it's never ruined a nation. Hardship and pain don't destroy families. What you do see is prosperity often does, but not hardship, not suffering. What it does is it pushes everyone to the same level. And we all now have the same goal. And that goal is survival in the midst of that. But we're working together. We're all even. We're all together, and we're working for survival. And it shouldn't be surprising here for us to see the Jews weeping and lamenting together because of what's about to happen. And so we go on, verse 4. It says, when Esther's young woman and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Esther must have wondered why Mordecai was there in the sackcloth and the ashes. She's probably thinking, like, what's happening? Why is he mourning this way? What must have gone on? And now that she's the queen, she's not permitted to go out there and talk to him. So she sends people to him with clothes. And it's her way of trying to comfort her cousin, who was really her caretaker. He treated her like he was her father when her parents died. And so she's trying to comfort him with these clothes. Like, it's okay, put these on. You can be done with that. We'll get through this. But he wouldn't do it. He would not accept those clothes. And so Esther sends a servant out again to find out what is going on. And we see this in verse 5. And we're going to read down through verse 8. It says, then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that happened to him, and that the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. So Mordecai tells this servant, like, this is what's going on. This is why I'm like this, and why I'm dressed like this. This is why I'm weeping and lamenting. And he also sends the edict with him to give to Esther. And what's impressive here is he doesn't lose control of his emotions. He doesn't exaggerate about the situation that's happening here. He gives the information just as it was. Now, why does that matter? It's because we live in a day of rumors and half-truths. They're everywhere. Most people don't give information accurately. They don't give it precisely. So how about us? What about you? What about me? Are we careful with what we say? Do we have the facts before we talk about things? Do we have the proof before we go out and we say things and this is what happened? Too many people have been hurt so deeply and so badly and have had even their lives destroyed by rumors, by half-truths, by exaggeration and gossip. And so we have to be careful what we say. We have to be careful how we say it. We have to be careful that we send the right message and that we send it to the right person and we do it with the right motives. We have to speak truth. And this is what Mordecai does here in this situation. He has some horrible news, and he knows that the queen needs to know this news, and he also asks her to do something about this. You've got to do something. Go to the king and beg and plead with him for our lives, for your people. He knows that if Esther is to do this, though, it could very well mean her own life. That she could lose her life to go to the king and beg for her people. Because so far, nobody knows that Esther is a Jew. Mordecai knows, but that's about it. And so what he does is he sends her the accurate account of what has happened, and he's asking her to do something about it. And he must have thought that when Esther's servant had come out, that this is like this is my one chance to get her to do something, to get the word to Esther and to see if she can do something. It's now or it's never. It's her time to stand in the gap for her people. That brings us to verse 9. We'll read down to verse 12. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke with Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come to the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Now, before you think that you would never respond like Esther does here in this moment, just think about this. If Esther obeys Mordecai, she stood to risk everything that she has right now, even including her life. If she would go and speak with the king, she could probably end up lose being the queen. She could lose that, be kicked out of the kingdom, and she most likely could lose her life. So all of this is going through her mind. And although the king is her husband, she couldn't just walk up to him and tell him what was on her mind, what she was thinking. That's not how things were happening in this time period and in Persia. She had to wait until she was sent for. As it was, she said, I haven't been sent for in a month. He hasn't called for me. And if you do go, you could be put to death, she says. Also, she was Jewish. Who knew how the king would respond to that if he found out that? This was a big problem for her. But Mordecai knew Esther, right? He had raised her. He had trained her. More importantly, he knew her character. He knew what she was made of. See, encouraging people to grow in their godly character is what we are called to do as the family of God. It's part of what we've just done this morning already, right? This is the call of God that it was placed on our lives as the people of God. It's to encourage us to grow and to know God and to be more like God and Jesus in our actual everyday lives. That's what this is about. And as we continue to build relationships together and as we grow closer together, we're going to have all of these opportunities to help each other grow. That's what we're called to. So let's grow together in Jesus. Let's see him glorified in us and through us. Let's encourage each other to stand on Jesus, who is the firm foundation, the sure foundation. Let's stand for what we believe in. This is what Mordecai is doing for Esther. And when he hears Esther's answer from her servant, he says what needs to be said. And this right here is an incredible moment. Here he says those famous words that are in the book of Esther. These powerful words here that if Esther would follow these could change the course of the history for the Jews. And we see these in verse 13 and 14. It says, Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all of the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This is one of those moments that's a turning point. Mordecai is saying to Esther here, if you don't do anything, don't think that you're just going to skate by here by being the queen. Because you're a Jew, you're going to end up dying with the rest of us. But then he says, guess what? God's not limited to just you, though. He will take care of us. He'll take care of his people. And we may perish, but God's going to keep his people. He will use someone else to save his people. But, Esther, what if he chose you? What if he chose you for this very reason and put you where you are for this moment? Could it be that's why you're the queen? For such a time as this, for this very moment. Whatever you do, don't be silent, he says. Stand, speak. And we see here that Esther shows us who she is. She shows her character. Her words show enormous faith mixed with a lot of courage. It's in verse 16. It says, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." See, she only had a few moments to think about her response to what Mordecai was asking her to do. But those few moments were all she needed. She determined to make a difference, no matter what the consequences might be for her. She says, if I die, I'll die. And I die. But I'm going to die doing the right thing. And she went from fear to faith. She went from hesitation to confidence. She went from concern for her own safety to the concern for her people's survival. She came to this point of decision-making, and she made a courageous choice. Now, do you remember when young David, who became king later on, was the sheep herder for his family? And one day he was asked by his father to leave the sheep behind and to take some supplies and food up to the battleground for his brothers, his older brothers, and to see how it went, because the Jews were being attacked in battle against the Philistines. And so he went off to the valley of Elah, where he met his brothers and the army. And when he got there, he found out that Goliath was on the battlefield at that moment, and he was taunting and he was blaspheming God. And when David finds out what's going on, he's like, we got to do something about this. We can't let this go on. And his older brother, his oldest brother, hears him say that, and he begins to mock him by saying, oh, you're going to be the one who saves us, huh? Young you, our youngest brother. And then he says, how are all our family's sheep doing now that you've left them to come out here to be with us? And David answers him and he says, what have I done now? Was it not just but a word? And then just a little bit later after that, David takes down this giant Goliath with one smooth stone in his sling. But David was basically saying in that moment, what are we doing on the sidelines just cowering by this in fear? We shouldn't be doing this. There's a giant out there who hates the cause of the living God. Why are we just standing here? Why aren't we doing something about it? Our God will fight for me. He will fight for us. And he said, I'm going out there, and if I die, I die. I'm not going to stand for this. Esther realized the same thing here. She realized that there was an enemy out there, not just of her people, but more importantly, an enemy of the living God. And once she understood that, she had to do something about it. Eugene Peterson, who gave us the Message translation, he wrote this about Esther. Let me just read this to you. He says, wherever there is a people of God, there are enemies of God. A realization that there is, in fact, an enemy forces a reassessment of priorities. He says, the moment that Haman surfaced, Esther began to move from being a beauty queen to becoming a Jewish saint, from being an empty-headed sex symbol to being a passionate intercessor, from the busy, indolent life in the harem to the high-risk venture of speaking for and identifying with God's people. Basically, what Esther did is she gave up her easy life of being the queen, and she's now going to stand up for God and stand up for God's people who she was a part of. And she says, if I die, I die. And with just the incredible amount of people that live on our world today and that we see around us all the time, we may not fully understand the importance of just one person. Sometimes we don't really see ourselves and value ourselves. We don't value our vote. We don't value our convictions. We don't value our determination to stand against things that are wrong. We may think to ourselves, what does it matter if I get involved or not? I'm just one person. Let me just tell you this morning, it matters very much. It matters to your character and who you are. Yes, God can use other things and God can use other people to get his ways done in our world today. He has other people to use. He isn't frustrated or stopped because you and I don't think that we can make a difference, that we don't need to get involved. But let me just tell you what happens when we don't get involved. We end up losing. We personally. We have been called for such a time as this. How disastrous if we aren't there to stand at that moment, at that time. And there's not going to be some shout from heaven calling us to take a stand. There's not going to be some flash of lightning to get our attention when we don't stand. It doesn't really work that way. So we just can't sit around and wait. There are so many needs and so many painful issues that are all around us, and they call us to stand up and do something about them. And we aren't going to be able to stand up and do something about every single issue and pain and hardship that's happening in our world. It's just impossible for one person to do. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't stand up for anything. So let me ask you right now, what are you doing right now to stand up, to even stand up alone to answer the call of God right now in your life? What are you doing? There are so many things that need our help, things like helping dysfunctional families, or helping the homeless and the hungry, or helping those that are addicted to drugs and alcohol, or helping those that are orphans and widows, and that list can go on and on. In such a time as this, who or what are you standing up for? Do you take a stand against pornography? Do you support anything with the pro-life movement? What about anything with the evils of sexual and physical abuse? Are you standing against racism and prejudices? There are so many, many needs out there. Are you being salt and light in this world? Are you standing up for the cause of Christ? I'm simply just saying to all of us, me included, stand up for what is right and stand up against what is evil. That's what we see here from Esther. That's what she's doing. And I'm not talking about politics here this morning. It's not what this is really about. What I'm talking about here this morning is knowing the heart of God, knowing his word, the Bible, and standing up for what he wants us to stand up for. To help the oppressed, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Now, how do we do that? How do we stand up for such a time as this? Just two quick things here this morning. First is we have to believe that one person can make a difference. See, when we believe that one person can make a difference, then we're willing to risk, to stand. You have to believe that we are that one person, that you are, that I am, so that we step up and stand up for what God has put on our hearts. Means that we have to stop worrying, too, about what other people are going to think about us standing up. We have to quit being so careful about our own selves all the time, and we don't answer to people. We actually answer to God. And the great thing is that God, he helps us. He's with us. He will give us wisdom. He will give us courage. And so you could be the only one who is standing in that moment. But God is with you. And you are one. You are standing. And so we risk. We stand in God's strength, knowing that he is with us and he will never leave us. And then second, we have to live in the reality of this world in order to make a difference. If we don't live in the reality of what is happening around us, we will never see it and will never then make a difference. Because if we don't see the hurts in the world, if we don't see the injustices, if we don't see the evil, then we're not going to make a difference. We have to live in the reality of it. And so when it comes time to vote, then we vote. You don't think about, oh, it'd be nice if I voted. We don't tell others how they should vote. We just vote. We vote our conscience. We vote what God is saying, and we take the time. You're someone who knows Jesus. That's great. Then go and do something about it. Say something about it. Even if you have to stand alone, then stand alone. And it's not just about thinking about things. It's about doing something about them. Sometimes as Christians, we're really good about theory. We have these theories about theology, and we have theories about what's good and right and what's wrong. And we know these things, and we know how they should go, but we never end up doing anything about them. We aren't rewarded for our theories. We're rewarded for doing. It's stepping out in faith and living as God would have us to. Now, does one person make a difference? Let me ask you this. Did Jesus? God loved the world so much that he did something. He stepped out. He didn't think, oh, it'd be great if somebody came down and rescued all those people down there. He didn't just grieve over the fact that we were separated from him because of our own sin. He did something about it. He sent Jesus. That's why we can be saved. Because of Jesus' life, that he was obedient to the God the Father. That it was about Jesus' death on the cross. That he died in our place for our sins. It's about Jesus' resurrection, that 3 days later, after being put in the grave, he rose to new life. That's how we can be saved, through faith and trusting him to be our Savior and giving all of ourselves to him. That's what it's about. We don't believe in theory. We believe in the person of Jesus, who died and rose again, and who can give us the might to make a difference. That our sins could be forgiven because of him, his life, death, and resurrection, and that we could take that good news of Jesus and share it with the world, that they could be a part of that as well. And so the question is like, it's not, what do you think about Jesus? The question is what are you going to do about Jesus? The question isn't so much, what do you feel about the message of the gospel of Jesus? It's the issue comes down to, what have you done about the gospel of Jesus? And this is what Esther shows us here. She was someone who had the courage to match her convictions. And you can say, well, okay, but that was way back then. This is today. She was dealing with things that were happening like in ancient Persia and for her own people. Our issues are so many today. There's so many things out there. But I'll tell you what, the need is still the same. The need is for people like you and me who are willing and ready to think, say, and do what is right. And we do that no matter what. We do what is right. Are you willing? Are you ready? Would you bow your heads this morning? With our heads bowed here this morning, we're going to close here in just a moment. You may not have known how challenging the book of Esther really is. But now, after going through chapter 4, we see how challenging the book of Esther really is. God has you here. Yes, you. For such a time as this. God has you here with your life experiences, to love Him and to love the people around you. To stand up for what is right. To stand against what is evil. And I'm going to give you a moment here with your heads bowed to pray. And I want you to begin to pray and ask God, God, what is it that you have me here for such a time as this? Maybe you already know what that is. But you haven't had the courage to stand. If that's you, I want you to pray, God, give me your courage and your strength to stand for what you're calling me to. And if you are standing this morning, would you just continue to ask God to give you that strength and that power? And then also this morning, one last thing. If you don't know Jesus, you can know Him today. He loves you, and that's the reason He came to this earth, is that you might know Him, that you might be set free from your sin and the mess of your life, and that you can live as a child of God through faith in knowing Jesus. And so if that's you this morning, we just ask Jesus to forgive you of your sins in prayer here and to come into your life, and that you surrender to Him. And so this is our prayer focus here, and we'll close here in just a minute. So take a moment to pray.